Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and to get things started off, I just want to give a shout out to a number of you followers as a thank you for joining me on this journey. So thank you to Simple Cowboy 88, Joyful Abandon, Plain City Sims, Saint Ma, Rowan, Maya Perkins, Every Day is Earth Day podcast, Marilee N, Deborah Johnson, Celine F, Shell K, Slacker, Breezy, Leo B, Teaspoon, Lanny, From Zero to Homestead, Leon, Chara, Christy, Wasati, Jeff Rowe, Ashley, Amy D, Pollinate the World, Kristen, Rusty Earn, Cassandra, Tom Herrican, Joey, BB12, Elliot Chaz, Diane, Coop, Daphne, Barb, and Rich. So thank you for joining me on your homesteading and gardening journey. So let's get stuck in and talk about one of the biggest investments you will make on your homestead, and I'm talking about a canner. Now, canning is a big investment for a small homestead. There's no ifs, ands or buts about it. For most people, a canner can be an expensive purchase, and it can also be kind of scary to invest in one. Pressure canners nowadays that have been manufactured, along with a wealth of information that's out there for safe canning methods, the risk of food poisoning from home food or home canned food is minimal, providing that you follow the canning recipe and the method correctly. And canning your own homegrown produce, or even produce that you get on sale at the grocery store, may actually help save you half the cost of what it would be if you were buying commercially canned food. And as a bonus, if you're growing or raising your own food and preserving those, then those home preserved foods may still actually be higher in nutritional value than the same thing bought at the store, or even the fresh produce bought at the store, because of how long it has taken to get here because of all the shipping. So I want to talk a little bit about how canning works first, and there's a few things that make foods go bad, right? We've got yeasts, molds, bacteria and enzymes. Most of them are microorganisms, but enzymes are not. They're actually a protein. And proper canning methods help to remove oxygen, destroy those enzymes, so they break them down. They help prevent nasty bacteria, yeasts and molds from growing, and they also form a vacuum in the jars that help keep the air and the microorganisms out of the food. And the one bacteria which is the scariest when it comes to home canning is Clostridium botulinum, and this is the one that causes a deadly form of food poisoning called botulism, which you might have heard about. And Clostridium botulinum can exist as a live bacteria or as a really sneaky protected spore. And this spore is like a little coating on it, and it helps protect it from extremes of heat. It can survive in the soil and water for a number of years, and it's quite harmless when it's out in the open. And when conditions are just right, the spores actually open up, and then the bacteria are able to be activated where they multiply and grow. And within 3 to 4 days, the bacteria may start to produce a deadly toxin that is actually seriously harmful to us. And I really don't make that statement lightly. And when it comes to canning food, I am really all about using safe canning methods. So I use methods from the University of Georgia and the National Home Food Preservation, and I use the USDA's Guide to Home Canning as my go-to resources. I also have the Ball Complete Guide to Canning, or the Complete Book of Canning, I think it's called. However, when I checked online, there was some ridiculous prices being asked for that book, which is insanity. It must be popular right now. But really, really, truly encourage you to look at the scientifically tested and approved methods for canning, because it is what's going to protect you and your family in the long term. So Clostridium botulinum loves a moist, low acid food. It loves a temperature between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 4 degrees Celsius to 49 degrees Celsius. And it loves a low oxygen or anaerobic environment. So if you were listening when I said that canning food helps to form a vacuum in the jars and keep air out, that's producing a low oxygen environment. And this is why it is really important to prepare foods correctly for canning. And methods of preparing the food for preservation are things like washing your fruits and veggies, peeling fruits and veggies, blanching, and, I can't stress this enough, using the proper canning method and processing time. It's those things which help ensure the destruction of those microorganisms, and that is what's really, really important when it comes to canning. So there's a couple of different types of canners. So there's a water bath canner, and there's also dial gauge pressure canners and weighted or rocker pressure canners. And the difference between the two pressure canners is really the method of measuring the pressure that is in that canner. And the difference between a water bath canner and a pressure canner is the temperatures that can be reached and what you can safely can in each canner. Now, I do want to let you know that in the show notes there is a link to a free cheat sheet all about canning methods that's going to help break down some of these things that you can print out and keep handy. So a water bath canner is suitable for acidified foods. So these are things like fruit, jellies, or jam to us Brits, pickles, chutney, relish, fruit pie filling, tomatoes with added acid. That's important. Fruit spreads, fruit sauces, and fruit juice. And a water bath canner works by heating jars of acidified foods that are completely covered with water, like completely covered, lids and all, with boiling water, and they're processed or kept boiling at the time that's stated in the recipe. And this is to ensure that the heat travels all the way through that jar and all the way through to the foods that are in the middle of that jar. So you will see when you look in a recipe book that there is different processing times depending on the size of the jar, because it takes time for that heat to travel, from that boiling water through the glass jar and into the food that is in there. Now, pressure canning is the only recommended method for canning meat, poultry, seafood, and vegetables. And it's because that bacteria, that Clostridium botulinum, is destroyed in low acid foods when they are processed at the correct time and temperature in a pressure canner. Using boiling water canners for those foods poses a serious and real risk of botulism food poisoning. So pressure canners are actually able to reach much higher temperatures because of that pressure, and that helps to kill off those spores that resist the heat. So a home pressure canner can actually ramp up to 240 degrees Fahrenheit or 116 degrees Celsius. That's way above that happy zone that Clostridium botulinum loves, right? If you remember earlier, I said it loved a temperature between 40 and 120 Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius to 49. So obviously a temperature of 240 Fahrenheit, way above its happy range. Okay, that is going to kill that bacteria spore off. Now, when I first started out, I got a graniteware water bath canner. And I also got a Presto pressure canner to start with, because I knew that I wanted to have that flexibility of being able to can low acid foods, things like green beans and those kind of veggies, as well as making jams and chutneys and things that I was used to making from England. And I've had mine for 7 years now, and the graniteware water bath canner is still going, the pressure canner still going. It was a great investment, considering how much food that we actually preserve every single year out of the garden, and that's just things that were canning. It's not including things that were freezing too. But last year I actually saved up my pennies and I invested in an All-American 41 quart canner. I like to call it the Beast because it is a freaking beast. It can handle about 32 standard mouth pint jars or 26 wide mouth pint jars or 19 quarts in one go, which makes a whole lot more efficient use of my time canning. Because if you've never canned anything before, there is a lot of prep work that's involved with it, because you've got to prepare, peel, slice, dice your veggies, fruits and all that good stuff. But on top of that, you've also got this time where those jars have got to process, right? That heat's got to travel all the way through that jar into the middle of the food and heat up to the right temperature to kill off all those nasty things that are in there that are going to turn the food bad and potentially hurt us. So actually having something that is going to be able to handle a lot more capacity and more jars in one go makes a lot more sense, because it's still going to take that same amount of processing time even if I've got 19 quart jars in there or if I'm just doing 7. So it's more efficient, just not just from time but also from a gas or propane usage standpoint as well. And this is why like a canner is a really important investment to make on your homestead, because from a long-term perspective, if you're going to be using it every year during harvest time to help preserve some of those things, or maybe you're going to do like what we did this week. We managed to get a bunch of chicken breast from the grocery store that was on sale, and we canned like 2 packages of it. So we've got like 25 pint jars of chicken breast that we can then use, and we can actually stretch out those jars even further in casseroles and soups. So we're actually making our food go a little bit further, which is great right now in the times that we're currently living in. So, one of the things to think about when you're wanting to invest in a brand new pressure canner, and I would always really recommend the largest one that you can afford, especially if you're going to be canning with it for many, many years to come, because they do last, and they last a long time, especially if you're going to take care of them. But you really want to be looking at something that's going to be able to accommodate different size jars and is going to make the most efficient use of not just your space, but your personal energy and also your actual method of heating. So like whether that's electricity or gas, that's something that you want to definitely consider. Now, I'm going to say this again, don't muck about when it comes to canning and your safety. You really must buy the proper canning equipment. It is an investment in your homestead and also an investment in yours and your family's safety and health, because medical bills for hospitalizations are expensive and funerals aren't cheap either. And that is the reality of canning. And I don't say this to scare you off. Like, I really wish more people can, but there's an appropriate way to do it. And you really should be taking that time. If you're taking that time to grow your own food anyway, and you're taking that time to preserve it, then you really should be taking the time to do it right in a safe method. And we do it safely by, number 1, using the right equipment, number 2, using the right recipe and canning method, something that has been tested to ensure that it's safe, and we use the right processing times and the right processing pressure, especially if you're living at an altitude. Thinking that a pressure cooker or a vintage canner is the same thing as a modern pressure canner and a cheaper alternative isn't, it's not the same. And quite honestly, using a pressure cooker or a vintage canner is going to end up hurting you in the long run, because you're not going to be able to attain those safe canning methods. So that heat, that pressure, and that time So when it comes to buying a canner, there's a few things that you really need to think about and some questions to ask yourself. So the first of all is, do you plan on fruits, preserves and acidified foods only, right? A lot of people just start out with tomatoes. And if you do, then you might just want to invest in a water bath canner only. They're relatively inexpensive. The graniteware ones are some of the cheaper ones, and they do last. I mean, they do eventually have issues with the enamel wearing, the rack inside them will rust, but as a starter canner to just kind of get your feet wet, they're a really good option for you. The next question is, what kind of stovetop or range do you have? If you've got a glass or an induction type of stovetop, then you really need to check that your canner is going to be suitable for those stovetops. Some are not. So the All-American canner, for example, is not suitable for glass. So really make sure that you check before you buy. Some canners have got a flat on the bottom. Some have like a bevel and like a bit that like pops out. So just check those things before you buy, because if your canner that you've just spent all that money on is not okay for the stovetop or hob that you have, then you've got to send that back or take it back, and then you might not be able to find the one that's going to work for you on your homestead. So it really pays to do a little bit of research before you're going to need it, so well before that harvest season is on. Next question is, do you have room to store the canner? So usually the canner's busted out at harvest time, right? But right now we're using our pressure canner a lot more. Our water bath canner is stored in the basement at the minute, and we're not using that. But the water bath canner, the pressure canner, is upstairs because we're using it a lot more often. Not everybody's got the luxury of having a lot of space, like a basement or a garage or something, to be able to store it. So think carefully about where you're going to store your canner, because obviously the bigger the canner, the more space it's going to take up. But also think about the empty jars that you're going to need to stock up on to be able to conduct your canning activities, and also where you're going to store those jars that you have made during the year, because you want somewhere that's going to be cool and dry and dark usually to keep that home preserved produce much longer. Number 4 is, how much can you lift? I say this because of the beast, right? That 41 quart All-American canner that I bought. Canners can be heavy at the best of times. The Presto ones are a lot lighter than the All-American canners, I will be honest. And the bigger the canner, the more metal's on there and the heavier it is. And that's before the jars and the water even go in. So if you're doing a water bath canner, then you've got all the jars that are in there, plus enough water to completely cover those jars. And water's heavy after a while. If you have difficulty lifting and moving a watering can of 3 gallons of water, then you're probably going to struggle with moving a water bath canner or a pressure canner. So you don't want to be getting something that's massive if you're going to have trouble lifting and shifting stuff. And if you do end up getting a big one, then definitely look at enlisting help whilst you are canning. Along the similar vein of how much can you lift is getting the right canner size for your stove. So your canner's diameter shouldn't be more than 4 inches or 10 centimeters wider than the diameter of the burner on the hob or stove. And that's to make sure that you've got the right amount of heat that's going in there, that things are going to be boiling and moving appropriately in there, to make sure that that heat is traveling all the way through that jar. So make sure you measure and check not only the canner's diameter, but also your burner or hob, so you know before you buy. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are 2 types of pressure canner. There's the dial or weighted gauge, and the difference is how they read the pressure. So a dial gauge shows you the pressure that you were at, kind of like the speedometer in your car. They're easy to see, easy to read, and you adjust the reading of the pressure by adjusting the heat on the stove. So turn it down to lower it, turn it up to raise it. You do need to monitor the gauge a lot more than you would a weighted or a rocker gauge, and you need to get that gauge, the dial gauge, inspected annually at least to make sure that it is accurate, because if it's reading the wrong pressure, then your jars are not going to be processed correctly, and then we run into that safety thing that I've probably terrified you all with. A weighted gauge is like little weights that sit on top of a vent, and you place the weight on the vent according to the altitude which you are going to be canning at. So I live at 4,000 feet, closer to 5,000 feet. I would look at my recipe and look in the canning manual that comes with my canner to see what pressure I need to be using it at. It's usually around 10 to 15, and I would put that on and then wait for it to jiggle. So the weights on top of the vent basically jiggle, dance or rock, and the heavier the weight is, the more pressure it takes to make that dance. So weighted gauges don't need to be checked annually like a dial gauge, but they do become easily lost, especially if you are not careful with the parts. And also new canners that are newer to using a pressure canner, they kind of feel a little bit put off by a rocker or a weighted gauge, because when do I know that it's operating right? Well, luckily there's a lot of information about that too, and you can actually even see videos now of when a rocker weighted gauge is at the appropriate pressure. The next question is for dial gauges, and that's where can you get your dials checked? So I mentioned that you need to get it checked annually. Well, here in the US, there's many extension offices that will check your canner dial, and they do it for a modest fee. Make sure you know like how you'll get your canner there, how much it's going to cost, and how long it's going to take. And bear in mind that you might need to leave the canner there and pick it up at a later time if it's in peak season. So if you've got a lot of other people that are wanting to be canning, guess what? They're going to be busy. So plan ahead, know where you're going to go, and get it there sooner before you need it. Other places of the world are going to be a little bit more tricky to figure out where you need to get that checked. Honestly, in the UK, I wouldn't know where to get that dial checked. I would have to do an internet search and try and find that out. Or just go for a rocker and a weighted gauge instead. In addition to an annual check on the dial, you should also get your dial checked if you accidentally drop it or drop the lid, you knock it, you move it so it's no longer in that same position, or it gets submerged in water because somebody else cleaned it for you and didn't realise that the dial should not have been put underwater. Don't ask me how I know these things and how they happen. Question number 8 is, do you intend to preserve? So if you're new to preserving, then you might not actually want to invest in a canner, even a water bath canner right away. And if you've never done it before, then I honestly would really recommend seeing if you've got friends or family who have a canner and set up a canning date, because you're going to get the opportunity of hanging out with people that hopefully you like, and learning a new skill whilst seeing the canner or the canners that they're using and what you like and don't like about them. And it's a great opportunity to kind of get your hands on them, be able to lift them, move them, see all the parts on them and see how they're actually operating. I spent a lot of time looking on YouTube to see what canners were available and what the pros and cons were about the different types of canner before I actually bought one. And although I upgraded now to a different type of canner, I upgraded it just because of the capacity. There's some things that I love about it, like the capacity and you can double stack, but there's also a lot of things that I really don't like about the canner. So, spend some time in doing your research, because it's going to pay off for you in the long run. And I see all the time that new homesteaders start with the water bath canner and canning tomatoes or making pie filling, and then they expand into pressure canning and wish that they started preserving that way sooner. And I know I started this podcast off with a little bit of doom and gloom and, some serious caution about canning. And that's because people don't often talk about, what some of those dangers are. And, I work in an environment where I'm very focused on quality and making sure that people have all the facts. So, as scary as it might seem, if you're following the recipe, so follow a reputable resource like, the Bowl Complete Preserving book, the USDA Canning Guide and the National Centre for Home Food Preservation, and you're using the appropriate equipment to do the canning, you should be fine. And, we use our pressure canner a lot. We make shelf-stable chicken, chili, beef stew, those kind of things, which make for incredibly fast weeknight dinners, which is great right now, especially when, you're kind of in the middle of the week and, a lot of people, especially those of us who are still working, we're working different hours, different shifts to try and make accommodations for the times that we're living in and to maintain those social distancing. And sometimes the last thing that you want to think about is what it is that we're going to cook. So using the pressure canner to make some shelf-stable chili or beef stew, oh my gosh, it's a game changer, because you just open that up, you dump it into a pan, heat it up until, it's boiling, heat it for 10 minutes or so. And then dinner's done. You really couldn't be any quicker than that. And, spending a few hours on a weekend getting things prepped for the next, not just 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, you can do a lot with even a small pressure canner. So head over to the Facebook group if you want to chat to me and to other homesteaders about canning and help you choose a canner that's right for you, or just don't forget that there is a free cheat sheet on canning methods that you can grab in the description. And I'm also going to put links to all of those items that I talked about in the description below, and also hook you up with the resources like the USDA and the National Centre for Home Food Preservation. Until next time, I hope you guys stay safe out there and that your garden grows beautifully.